Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Iron Sharpens Iron Bible Study Podcast, and welcome to week 4 of our study into hope for facing storms. This week's episode is entitled, What Was Daniel Thinking? Daniel is an ordinary man who goes through extraordinary circumstances. Daniel lived in Judah during the time when the Babylonians attacked Judah and captured all of their important higher up people in the nation. Daniel was one of those important people. As a young man, he's captured and taken back to Babylon and put into the service of the king. God gave Daniel learning and skill in all literature and wisdom and in visions and dreams. We see that in Daniel chapter 1. This allows Daniel to give God's messages to the rulers of Babylon throughout the time of Babylon's empire. The 5th chapter records the end of the Babylonian Empire and the rise of the Persian Empire. When the 6th chapter begins, Daniel would now be an old man who has lived most of his life away from home, serving foreign kings and delivering God's message to those kings. Daniel has given his life to the Lord in very difficult circumstances. After serving various kings throughout the Babylonian administration, you can imagine the concern that would arise for him now that a whole new government is in charge. The Babylonians have been conquered, and now the Persian Empire is in charge. So, what would happen to those who served for the Babylonian administration? When we look at the changes in our administration, we know how our peaceful transition in government works. When we have a new president, no one from the prior administration is to remain. The cabinet is changed, the chief of staff is changed, and the advisors are changed. There's a widespread change with the new administration that is put into place. Without a peaceful transition, you can imagine that being fired was not the fear, but death for those who had served the Babylonian administration. The first verse of Daniel 6 shows Darius, the new ruler of the Persian Empire. He appoints 120 people to be rulers over the whole kingdom, and he appoints 3 high officials who were over them so they could give an account to the king. So we can see this overhaul of leaders and advisors, and amazingly, Daniel is made one of the 3 high officials. He survives the transition of leadership in the empire and becomes distinguished above all the king's advisors and rulers. One can imagine the tenuous position Daniel is in, being a carryover from the Babylonian Empire. We learn in verse 4 of chapter 6 that the administrators and officials hate Daniel because he is excelling in the Persian Empire. But there is nothing that they can do about Daniel's authority in the empire because he is a faithful and trustworthy person. There was no corruption in Daniel and no grounds for complaint. What these officials and administrators know is that Daniel serves his God, and the only way to bring a charge against Daniel will have to be regarding his service to his God. Now, I want you to consider that they all know that he worships and serves God. This is not a secret. Not only is this not a secret, they understand that Daniel's devotion to God is so great that this is the only way that they have to try to get Daniel in trouble. Now, this is worth thinking about for a moment. Would our enemies know that the only way to cause us to be disobedient or bring a charge against us would be because of our faith in God? Would they know that our faith in God is so strong that this would be the only point of attack against us? There are 2 things that we see these officials knowing about Daniel. First, they know Daniel is very devoted to God. And they know that Daniel's faith in God is unwavering. But I want us to explore how this plays out for Daniel. So we're going to pick up in verse 6 of chapter 6 in Daniel. And we'll read down through verse 9 to begin here. It says, Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document, that is, the injunction. So the officials and the administrators of Persia, they come to the king with their plan. They want to have a very simple decree enforced, issue an ordinance that for 30 days, everyone make their requests only to the king. Anyone who makes a request to any god or man except the king for these 30 days will have the injunction enforced by being cast into a den of lions. So the king, he signs the law into effect so that it cannot be repealed. So, the plan, it's pretty simple, and the injunction is temporary. The law would only last 30 days, and the law seems fairly innocent. For 30 days, you need to make your petitions to the king only. And after 30 days, your life will return to normal. Now let's pick up here in verse 10, and I'll read down through 13. It says, Now when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber he had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had done as he had been doing previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? The king replied, The statement is true according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Then they answered and spoke before the king. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. I want us to carefully observe here verse 10. It says, When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where his windows were opened. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and he prayed to God just as he had done before. Please think about what Daniel did. I mean, read it again and think about it. What was Daniel thinking? If you've read this text before, have you ever thought about or wondered, what is Daniel doing? What is going through his mind? The officials of the land determined that for 30 days, people should only make their petitions to the king and no one else. The decree was only for 30 days. Think about all the things that Daniel could have changed to conform to the government's rule. Daniel could have closed his windows so that no one would know that he was still praying to his Lord. Daniel could have lessened the frequency of his prayers. He didn't have to pray 3 times a day. Where did the scripture say that you have to pray 3 times a day? He didn't have to do that. He could have prayed less each day to avoid detection. Daniel could have prayed quietly in his heart, not aloud, so that others would not know he was still praying. Daniel could have stopped praying altogether. It was 30 days that he would have to stop praying, and then he could return to praying like he had done before. Daniel certainly could have considered making adjustments or modifications to how he approached God. But rather than making any adjustments or modifications, Daniel returns to his home and continues to do just as he had done before. The injunction clearly stated that petitions were only to come to the king, or else you're going to be thrown into a den of lions. Yet Daniel doesn't seem to hesitate for a moment. Daniel hears the injunction, he goes home, and he prays. Why wouldn't he just stop praying for 30 days? Why wouldn't he just change how he prays? Why doesn't Daniel try to figure out a way to obey the government order while still obeying God? When the charge is made against Daniel, they state, he pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Daniel, he doesn't change anything. I mean, it's amazing. Daniel changes nothing. He just does as he did before. So what? What was Daniel thinking? First, Daniel, he understood that we obey the government until it conflicts with our faith. It's clear from Daniel 6 that Daniel obeyed his king and government in all that he did. Daniel had distinguished himself in the kingdom so that no charge could be found against Daniel by his opponents. Daniel was not a disobedient person. But when the law was given, which meant that it would be illegal for Daniel to pray to his Lord, even though it was just temporary, he couldn't obey the government. He couldn't change anything that he'd done in his worship, his service, and his love for his God. This is a very important principle for us to understand. Yes, we are called to obey the governing authorities because they are given to us by God. We see that in Romans 13. But the scriptures are filled with instances where God's people disobey the governing authorities because it goes against God's will. The Hebrew midwives are praised for not carrying out the orders of Pharaoh in Egypt to kill male babies when they are born in Exodus 1. Rahab doesn't carry out the orders of the city to turn over the Israelite spies in Joshua 2. Daniel's 3 friends disobey the order of Babylon to bow down to an image back in Daniel 3. And then going to the New Testament, the apostles were directly told by the governing authorities of Jerusalem to not talk about Jesus in Acts 4 and Acts 5. But the apostles, they made a very important response. They said, we must obey God rather than people in Acts 5:29. Recently we faced a similar challenge. Back when COVID first came out, the mayor of New York City, that he came out and said that if people went to worship, he would permanently close those churches. And governors in various states declared that, if you were to go to church, you would be fined and arrested if you went to worship God. And there was actually an arrest that I remember seeing on the news that happened in the Tampa, Florida area for holding worship services. Even churches that were maintaining social distancing guidelines were being threatened. There were churches when they went to church, they stayed in their cars and listened to the sermon on FM radio, and they were targeted by the police and public officials. We need to check our faith in moments like those and ask ourselves if we're going to obey God or if we're going to obey people. Are we going to cave to social pressures or follow our faith? Being prevented from worshiping God is no longer a theoretical that we've talked about in the pews of our church for years. Now there are various authorities that are saying not to worship and issuing threats if we do. We have to look at God like Daniel did. We cannot change what we are doing for God, and we must obey God rather than people. We will obey the government as long as and as far as we can until it conflicts with our spiritual pattern with God. This is why Paul instructed Timothy to pray for our leaders and rulers so that we can live a quiet and peaceful life with the goal of spreading the knowledge of the truth about Jesus in 1 Timothy chapter 2. I've kind of gone on a tangent here, so let's just have a quick refresher. The Persian Empire has overthrown the Babylonians. Darius, the Persian king, begins to appoint officials, and Daniel is selected to be one of those 3 officials. There were some who were not too excited about Daniel's appointment, so they were looking to trap him. Knowing that he's devoted to his God and petitions and prays to him 3 times a day, they talked the king into signing an injunction that all petitions be brought before him for 30 days, and then everything will go back to the way that it was before. And after hearing this, we see Daniel, he continues to do just as he had always done. So we've covered the first point I wanted to make in our lesson. Daniel understood that we follow man's law until it conflicts with the law of God. And going back to Romans 13, verses 1 and 2, it says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves." So we follow the laws set by men until they conflict with God's law. Second, Daniel understood that God was more precious than life. Daniel shows that he was willing to die for the ability to continue praying to his Lord 3 times a day. That's a challenging thought. Daniel would rather die praying than live not praying for 30 days. Daniel would rather die maintaining what he had always done in his worship and devotion to the Lord than live by changing his spiritual routine. We have to ask ourselves, do we feel as strongly about our relationship with God as Daniel did? If we were told to not pray for 30 days, would that really be a problem for us? Prayer is supposed to be so vital to us that we would never consider stopping. Worship is supposed to be so vital to us that we would never consider stopping. Everything about God is so critical to our lives that we would never change, alter, or stop what we're doing. God was more precious than life to Daniel. This is why the apostles died for following and proclaiming Jesus. This is why the Christians in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries died for their faith. They understood that God was more precious than life. Life is not the highest priority. Faithfulness is. Faithfulness is our highest priority. Life has never been the highest priority. We gave examples about the Hebrew midwives and Rahab that show that truth. This is why Paul wrote to the Christians in Corinth in 1 Corinthians 7 about their impending crisis and why they wouldn't want to marry at that time. Their faith was going to be challenged, and protecting life is not our highest priority. Faithfulness is our highest priority. But Paul knew that holding to that truth was harder when you have a spouse and a family. Faithfulness to God is the priority. We must be willing to die being faithful rather than live being unfaithful. Daniel would have rather died praying than live not praying for 30 days. Third, Daniel understood he belonged to a different kingdom. He lived in the kingdom of Persia, but he was a citizen of the kingdom of God. He knew that he belonged to a different kingdom. We can't be ashamed of this truth or hide this truth. We belong to the kingdom of God and not the United States of America. We live here but obey God because we belong to God. Our faith will be tested, and Jesus knows this. Luke chapter 9 and verse 26, it says, "For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in his glory and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels." Daniel shows that God is to be our very lives. Jesus is the air that we breathe, the water we drink, and the food that we eat. We see that in John chapter 4 and chapter 6. We should rather die than have any aspect of our spiritual life be subtracted from us. Daniel was willing to be thrown to the lions, and his friends were willing to be thrown into the fiery furnace because God was their treasure and their very lives. They belonged to a different kingdom, the kingdom of heaven. And so do we when we walk by faith like they did. That's all I have for this week's episode. As always, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Until our next sharpening session, stay steadfast, stay inspired, and may your faith continue to grow sharper each day. This is the Iron Sharpens Iron Bible Study Podcast. And until next time, God bless.